So I'm Vicki Esses from the Pathways to Prosperity, and Julie and I today are going to be talking about our partnership and the type of research we do, and then giving an example of some research we've done on the information needs of newcomers. I will talk about some of the research, the recent projects that we've been working on, and many of the reports from these projects are available in the library on our website. Then Julie and I will be talking about research on the information needs of immigrants. As you heard Alice mention earlier, getting information out to newcomers is one of the most important things that we can do to improve the settlement of immigrants in the province. And then we'll be talking about some current and upcoming projects. Okay, so very briefly, the Pathways to Prosperity is an alliance of university, community, and government partners. And our work is dedicated to fostering welcoming communities and promoting the integration of immigrants and minorities in Canada. We have base funding from a 7-year partnership grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, which we received in 2012, so we've just been going for a couple of years. We do primary research, that is research where we actually go out and collect data in a variety of ways. We also do secondary research, which involves bringing all the research together and looking at the conclusions that we might draw from that. We do quite a bit of knowledge transfer, so we have a bilingual website, and the URL you'll see is here. We send out a bi-monthly e-bulletin. We have an annual conference, workshops, roundtables, etc. And just to give you an idea of some of the recent work that we've been doing, and again, if you're interested in some of these projects, please communicate with us or go on our website and take a look at some of the reports from these projects. So as people have talked about, we were involved in the Alberta Settlement Outcomes Survey a couple of years ago. We were involved in the Western Settlement Outcomes Survey. We've done quite a few projects now looking at the information needs of immigrants and what strategies we might use to fill these needs. We've done work on immigrant youth and seniors in Alberta. We've done now several projects looking at official language minority communities. This involves development of a survey to look at the integration of immigrants in these communities, and some analysis of some of the pre-existing data from things like the census or the Canadian Community Health Survey, looking at how official language minority immigrants are doing. And we've done quite a bit of work looking at local immigration partnerships and also the réseau. And our most recent report posted on our website talks about two things: how we might improve the alignment or the connections between the LIPs and the RIFs so that they work more cooperatively together, and then also an evaluation strategy. So we've developed an evaluation strategy because, of course, LIPs and RIFs don't do direct service delivery. We've looked at factors that contribute to the benefits of internships for internationally qualified professionals. So what makes an internship effective? Julie led a project looking at the role of employers in bridging newcomers' absorption and integration. We've looked at improving the assessment of international students' contribution to Canadian society, and we've done quite a bit of work on innovative and promising practices within the immigrant settlement sector, looking not only at, how do you identify a promising practice, but more important, what makes it effective, and then how can you take those critical ingredients and use them in other locations. So we were asked to talk about data, and Julie and I will be talking now about the information needs of immigrants pre and post-arrival, and then strategies for filling these needs. So many of you have already seen the Alberta Settlement Outcomes Survey and some of the results from that. And what I will talk about now is some analyses using multivariate analysis. So that sounds complicated, but it isn't that complicated. So this is taking the data from the Alberta Settlement Outcomes Survey and doing these analyses which really isolate the overlapping effects of multiple factors. And so what do I mean by that? You might find, for example, that immigration category, source region, and English language ability are all predicting an outcome. And how do you determine which is most important, and also their independent effects? So we might find that the immigration category is related to the source regions that people are coming from, is related to English language ability, and then you can't really figure out which is the most important driver of an outcome. And that's what multivariate analysis does. It helps to determine the independent, unique effects of these different factors. So there are quite a few results from the multivariate analysis, but I'm just going to talk about a few of them. And again, this is focused only on the information needs of newcomers to Alberta and then how we might fill these needs. And so to start, one of the findings of the research was that the vast majority of immigrants, and in some cases up to 90%, would find it really helpful to receive information about important documents they'll need, important things they should do before and after they arrive in Alberta, where to obtain settlement information. This is something we hear over and over again, that some newcomers don't know where to obtain settlement information. And then also information about Alberta healthcare and getting a job in Alberta. But not all immigrants have the same need for this information. And so, for example, one of the findings was that immigrants from certain regions, from Southeast Asia and the Pacific, as well as those from South and Central Asia, Africa, and Latin America and the Caribbean, are especially keen to receive more information on these topics. So if we have limited resources and we're trying to get information out, we might try and target particular groups who are expressing a particular need. And as John mentioned, this PowerPoint is posted on the website, so the findings are available to you there. So assuming that immigrants need better information, what are they saying about their desired means of obtaining settlement information from the government? And one of the findings was that immigrants want to get settlement information through internet websites, as well as through printed materials, over the phone, surprisingly, through in-person individual sessions. And so many of you already know that, but what's interesting is that these preferences differ by immigrant characteristics. So for example, internet websites are less preferred by immigrants from a number of regions outside of what we would call, Western Europe, UK, and the US. Also, people with lower levels of education, poor English language ability, and those who are 55 and over also are less keen on getting information from the internet. But there are some interesting findings about the ease of using the internet. And so what we find is that sometimes there are differences before people arrive, but once they get here, there are fewer differences. So for example, prior to arrival, immigrants from Southeast Asia and the Pacific, Central and South Asia, and Africa are about 50% less likely to find it easy to use the internet compared to immigrants from other regions, from Western Europe, the UK, and the US. But this effect no longer exists post-arrival. So once they get here, this lack of access to the internet no longer exists. And also, as you might imagine, prior to arrival, refugees, family class immigrants are markedly less likely to have internet access. Again, after arrival, this is no longer the case, but what we do find is that dependents of provincial nominees experience more difficulties with obtaining access to the internet. And then, of course, immigrants with less education, with weaker English language skills, and older immigrants find it harder to access the internet before and after moving to Alberta. So what you can see is some of these findings are intuitive. They match what we might expect. Others are a bit more surprising, at least to me, that once people get here, the differences among groups wash out, and internet access is actually quite available to many people. Okay, and then finally, information-related difficulties associated with obtaining help to settle in Alberta. And so this is something you've heard many times today, I think. The primary difficulties that immigrants experience in using settlement services are lack of information or awareness of services, confusion about who to go to in order to get help, and language difficulties. And lack of information or awareness of services is particularly likely to be experienced by principal applicants in the Canadian Experience class, refugees, dependents of skilled workers, and family class immigrants. And as we also already heard today, poor English language skills prevent immigrants from using settlement services because this leads to a lack of information or awareness of services and confusion about who to go to in order to get help. Okay, so this is the analyses that came from the Alberta Settlement Outcome Survey. After this, we actually did some follow-up research that Julie's now going to talk about involving focus groups.
So in order to capture a more deeper understanding of the needs of immigrants in Alberta, a number of focus groups were conducted in 4 communities here in Calgary, Edmonton, Grand Prairie, and Brooks. And in each location, focus groups were held with new arrivals who had been in Alberta for less than 1 year, and also focus groups with immigrants who had been in Alberta between 1 and 4 years. And in total, there were 94 participants to Alberta who participated in these various discussion sessions, and immigrants were included from a variety of immigration categories and countries of birth. So I'd now like to share with you some of the highlights of the findings from the focus group sessions, and a number of challenges were revealed. An important challenge identified by respondents involved language, and we've talked a lot about that today. Language problems can impede social and economic integration and limit immigrants' ability to access services in these domains. A related challenge also arises from the complexity of integration and the need to navigate fragmented systems. When we think about incomplete or misleading information, including that supplied by corporate recruiters, refugee and family sponsors, and also ethnocultural and faith organizations, can be problematic. Some of the main pre- and post-arrival information sources were also identified. Pre-arrival, the internet, and family and friends in Canada serve as the primary sources of information. Preferred pre-arrival websites were identified. These include CIC's website for information about application procedures and the Government of Alberta's website for information about provincial services. It's important to note that the Alberta site received especially high marks for its usefulness and its ease of navigation. An interesting finding is that newcomers are using social media like Facebook and YouTube videos to prepare for settlement. And post-arrival, newcomers rely on settlement organizations and government services, notably Service Canada and Alberta Works. In terms of some of the specific information required earlier in the settlement process, including pre-arrival, include 3 areas here on this slide. You'll see education, so looking for information about educational equivalency, bridge training, and the education pathways that must be followed to work in various occupations. Language, so that's seeking information about the critical importance of strong language skills for finding work, and also employment, finding information about job search techniques, interview preparedness, and training workshops, along with challenges commonly faced in varied employment areas. We also see a need for some specific information around needed documents and references. So people would like to receive very practical advice about the kinds of documents and references needed, for example, to get a driver's license, to secure accommodation, housing, and how to qualify for employment or specialized training. There's also an interest in specialized information targeting youth. That would be information about special programs and services for immigrant youth and information that addresses their concerns. And other types of information, such as living costs, affordable housing, schools, healthcare, immigration and citizenship regulations and procedures, and the services offered by community organizations are all among some of the specific information needs that could be required earlier on in the settlement process, including pre-arrival. In terms of recommended solutions to the confusion that exists regarding available settlement services, disseminating information in multiple languages at key immigration processing sites, especially pre-arrival, enhancing the expertise and knowledge of early communicators, including ethnocultural and faith groups that do play a role in facilitating and providing that information, and also placing more of an emphasis on corporate recruiters and family and refugee sponsors to provide better information. There's also an interest in having earlier face-to-face meetings with multilingual counselors who are able to better direct newcomers, and also one-stop shops, both real and virtual, targeting locations with significant immigrant populations. Okay. In terms of the use of social media and YouTube, it was quite interesting to see that focus group participants were quite enthusiastic about expanding the use of social media and YouTube to communicate settlement information, especially in forging connections with youth. The respondents in the focus groups advocated expanding Alberta's use of Facebook and Twitter beyond the provision of labor market information. And we're also interested in YouTube videos that conveyed information in multiple languages or with subtitles in multiple languages about topics like job interviewing, how to prepare for a job interview, how to behave, were regarded by the participants as extremely valuable. There's also a role for ethnocultural and faith groups. There was broad support among the participants for using faith, ethnocultural, and community organizations to help convey settlement information and to direct immigrants to where to obtain help and assistance. These institutions are trusted by immigrants. They can communicate in immigrants' native languages and offer networking opportunities. And so there was interest in some of the strategies that rely more heavily on these organizations would need to improve the quality of the information they provide. And so now Vicki is going to come up to talk to you a little bit about some of our current and upcoming research projects through P2P.
Okay, I'm not going to go into too much detail about some of our current and upcoming projects, just to give you a taste for what we do. And I also want to mention that deciding on our research directions is really an ongoing process that is responsive to the research needs of practitioners and policymakers. And we are really interested in how the emerging priorities of the sector can be informed by research, and we do really welcome your input into this. So here are some of the projects that we are currently involved in, and Julie is leading the project on the immigrant labor market integration, for example. The Pathways to Prosperity has co-investigators in all the provinces, and these are some of the projects that they are currently initiating. So projects looking at language ability, parent and grandparent sponsorship, seniors. Abdi Kazemapur is looking at Muslim immigrants, recruitment and retention of newcomers. We have a project looking at the art of immigration. Work on international students, etc. There's a lot. So, and let me just conclude by saying that we also fund projects through a call for proposals that we put out. So these are some of the projects that have recently been funded through our call for proposals. So looking at pre-arrival strategies, of settlement and integration of Filipinos in Alberta, for example, more on international students, employment, orientation for living caregivers, etc. Okay, so these slides are on the AAISA website, and again, I encourage you to look at the Pathways to Prosperity website for more information. If you'd like to get on the mailing list for our e-bulletin, you can email communications@p2pcanada.ca. This comes out every 2 months with the updates on our project, and I encourage you just to take a look at what's available within our project. So thank you.
Thank you. One of the most common questions we always get asked on a research panel is, so what? You didn't tell us anything we didn't already know in our hearts and in our everyday. Every piece of research always gets exactly the same critique. But when you live at the nexus between policy, practice, and research, you look at evidence like this on information and you say, when I apply to the province or CIC or my other funder, and they say, prove there's a need, that's what you use this for. You don't say, I had 52 clients that came into my agency last year, ergo there's need. You can say, tens of thousands of people were interviewed over the following set of processes, and there's clearly a need. When I'm trying to decide which information channel to use, should I be advertising in ethnocultural press? Should I have signs at the airport? Should I be tweeting to individuals? You can go and you can look at the more complex data, because you just got the super high level here, because that's all we have time for. And you can actually find underpinnings that suggest where you as agencies or as other players in the settlement sector can go to try to figure out what your most effective strategy for the dollars you have available will be. There's a really rich body of research that they've done around information and what channels and what kinds of newcomers access what kinds of information that would really inform lots of the work that we do. So I strongly encourage you to go and have a look at that information. I'd like to turn over to Lori, who I think is going to talk about the Western Settlement Outcomes Survey and labor market in particular.
Okay, thank you very much. First, I'd like to thank AAISA, especially Milton, Fairbours, and Denise for their lovely invitation for me to come here. Second of all, because we're all either old comers or newcomers ourselves, I'd like to recognize the fact that we're on Treaty 6 territory, home of the Cree Nation. And today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a project that I'm working on for Citizenship and Immigration Canada through my research group, Immigration Research West. I've been challenged with giving 5 different data sets, and what I've been asked to do is, if I can see a trend in one data set, can I replicate that trend, or can I see that trend in another data set? And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I've been doing today with an eye on Alberta. And because I've only been given it a short period of time, I'm only going to talk a little bit about labor market outcomes. But some of the other areas that we're looking at in this project include settlement service use, feelings of belonging, and language use as well. Oh, here we go. So I'll let you read some of the demographics about Alberta, but I do want to point out that according to the National Household Survey, 644,000 people who live in Alberta were not born in Canada. So that's a significant number of people. Not all of them need services, but that amounts to about 18% of your total population. But if we look at the labor market contribution of this group, they make up 21% of the labor market. What makes Alberta a bit different, and the West in particular, when we look at immigration, is that immigrants to the Western provinces are more likely to live outside of the big centers like Edmonton and Calgary. So if you look in the top left-hand corner, 16% of immigrants in Alberta live in rural areas, and another 13% live in the smaller cities. So what have we found so far? I'll start with unemployment rates. Not surprisingly, Alberta immigrants have the lowest unemployment rate in Canada. I've only put the Western provinces up here. That does, the finding, we can replicate this finding in the data sets I'm looking at, but I can also replicate this finding with a really nice report published this year by Alberta Labour, which also verifies these trends. But the bad news is that of all of the unemployed people in Alberta, 22% of them are immigrants. So they're overrepresented amongst the unemployed. If we look at some of the surveys that I've looked at have asked questions about how easy is it for you to find job-related information, or how easy is it for you to find information about what you need to do to find a job. And the good news is that in Alberta, immigrants are some of the most comfortable in Canada. In other words, Alberta immigrants find it easiest to find the information in Canada. I think they're ranked number 2 nationally. The bad news is that immigrant women have a more difficult time, and in fact, if you look at the bars here, the women are the red bars. Women have a more difficult time finding job information across every province. So the trend here is very similar. A number of the surveys that we were asked to take a look at had similar questions related to the Canadian experience. So one of the things that we hear as researchers, and I'm sure you hear in your jobs as well, is that I'm having trouble finding a job because I don't have Canadian experience. That's what they'll tell me. A number of people find it difficult to find a job because they lack Canadian experience. The good news is that in Alberta and Saskatchewan, in Alberta in particular, 40% of those living in urban areas felt that their lack of Canadian experience held them back from getting a job, which is the lowest in the country. The bad news is the people who live in the smaller centers in Alberta and Saskatchewan in particular are the most likely to cite lack of Canadian experience as a barrier for them to find work. And we verified this in 2 other data sets as well. Then there were some questions about the match between my job and my skill set, or the difficulty I find in having a job that matches my skill set, kind of a foreign credential recognition problem. Immigrants in Alberta and Saskatchewan report the highest rates of mismatch between their job and their previously acquired work experience and credentials. It's not as pronounced in Alberta as it is in Saskatchewan, but it is a problem. And if we look at immigrant class, the groups that are most likely to have this problem are family class and refugees. On the good news side, however, if you look at those who are skilled or professional workers, they have the lowest rate of this kind of difficulty. We were able to verify this with other data as well. Then some of the questions that were asked of immigrants across the 5 data sets were, how satisfied are you with the information that you get before you arrive with regards to credential recognition? And the good news is that Alberta immigrants are among the most satisfied in terms of their pre-arrival foreign credential recognition information. But the problem is if we look at those numbers, they're still kind of low. So they're less than 50%. Again, maybe leave some room for some work here, and also a trend that we've verified in other data sets. Here's where I think is the most interesting stuff that we've been looking at right now. I'm going to take a minute here to explain this table. So this table looks at the some information that we need to know to understand what kind of jobs immigrants had before they came to Canada, what kind of jobs they had afterwards. And the reason that I'm interested in this is because if you worked really hard, you have a good education, you have lots of work experience, and that doesn't translate into something similar in Canada, you're not going to be happy in your job. If you're not happy in your job, it's probably going to bleed over to happiness with your family, happiness with your community, your sense of well-being, your self-esteem. That's going to have some huge implications for you, which has huge implications for your feelings of belonging in this country. So if we look at the left-hand side column, pre-arrival, the cell in yellow says 47%, and it also says NOC A. Those are skills or jobs which require university-level education with high levels of skills, like being a lawyer, like being a physician. The NOC D, the last row, are the kinds of jobs where you don't need any kind of education. So they would be occupations such as agricultural help. You don't need any kind of formal education. If we jump back to the first row, once again, we can see that 47% of all immigrants who come to Canada have one of these very high-skilled occupations. But if we look at their post-arrival job, that number declines by almost 20%. I put the Canadian numbers here in orange, just to give you an idea of where Canadian-born people fall on this scale. So basically what I'm trying to tell you here is that post-arrival, there's a 9% difference between what the immigrants could do and what they are doing versus what Canadians are doing, and also that there's a 20% drop, because we know that the point system privileges people who have income. The other point I want to make about this table is that many people say, well, there's many Canadian-born people who are working in jobs that they're overqualified for. A recent Statistics Canada study released in April found that only 15% of Canadians are working in a job that they're overqualified for. So these numbers are huge. Immigrants are feeling this significantly. Is there a difference by province? No, it's not statistically significant difference by province, but we can see that if we just look at status decline or increase, 50% of all immigrants receive a status decline in their job, regardless of the province that they live in. But if we look at this a bit differently or more deeper, we look at it by entrance class, we can see that there's some significant differences here. So refugees, not surprisingly, face significant job status declines, upwards of 50 or 75% in Saskatchewan, with a low of 53% in Alberta, meaning that if you're coming to Alberta as a refugee, you're the least likely to have a job status decline in the western provinces, but it's still not that great, right? We're still talking about over 50% of people having job status declines. But if we look at other classes, the provincial nominee class, we get a different story here. So in Manitoba and Alberta, PNs see the largest status decline, which is kind of interesting because you would think there'd be a better job match at this entrance class, but there isn't. If we look at the skilled worker class, there's still a large mismatch as well, with Manitoba being the worst at 66%, but Alberta coming in second at 55%. But again, with this group, because they're exposed to the point system, we would expect this data to be lower. So I'm going to summarize. What do we know about the labor market conditions of immigrants in Alberta? Well, mostly strong if we only consider the unemployment rate. But if we dig a little bit deeper about the match between skills and actual job, we see that there's some huge problems in Alberta, but also across the western provinces. And if I haven't shared the rest of Canadian data, it's the same. So it's not a provincial problem, it's a Canadian labor market problem. Why should we be concerned? Well, because if we've got people who are working at jobs that they're overqualified for, they're not going to be happy in their job. That's going to bleed into their family life, their community life, and their sense of belonging to Canada. I'm asked why I think this might happen. In Alberta in particular, there's, the labor market's a premium here, right? So you do get paid a little bit more, and maybe the immigrants who are coming to Alberta are more likely to want to absorb less income and less happiness between their skill set and their job in order for higher pay to come here. But again, I think that if there's too much mismatch between job status and actual job, there's going to be some problems with a sense of belonging and feeling like you're part of society. I'm part of a group called Immigration Research West. We've got a bunch of reports online on our website, which I would encourage you to see. We also have a number of research reports research projects that are ongoing right now. Anna's going to talk to you about one that we'd like you all to participate in, but we also have some projects related to a GIS mapping project for immigrants. We have some other smaller projects that are coming out in a little while, and we're co-hosting the national conference for Metropolis in Vancouver, which is the 26th to the 28th of March. And I would encourage you to come and contact us if you're interested in attending. Thank you very much.